Silicon Valley's CEO. As many of you already know, ACGSV is the leading business-to-business networking organization in Silicon Valley, providing connections, thought leadership, and enabling personal and organizational growth. We offer an array of networking opportunities with almost 15,000 members in 59 chapters across the world. ACG provides local connections with a global reach. ACG Silicon Valley is offering a variety of virtual events in the coming months. We invite you to visit our website at acgsv.org to see the full calendar, including discussions on cybersecurity, as well as some really fun networking events with other ACG chapters, and a virtual wine tasting on September 24th. So if you're interested in something new, join us for that. If you have any questions regarding ACG Silicon Valley, I'm happy to have a one-on-one with you and discuss your possible involvement with our 36-year-old chapter. My door is always open, so just connect with me. Now, we're excited to offer you today's event, which would not have been possible without our sponsor, I'm going to say it wrong, Singer-Lueck, a top 100 accounting and consulting firm in the West region. So thank you. And without further ado, I will hand over to Bob so he can introduce you to Kelly and himself and get this event started. Bob?
Very good. Thank you, Yvonne. And also thank you to Carol for coordinating this and making sure we got ready to go here and set up and been so gracious with everything. So both Kelly and I want to thank you for that. And also, this is nice. I mean, we're in an event where, you know, we can actually see some of you, and I appreciate that it's not a huge crowd. So hopefully we'll hit some points that that are important to you. And during this presentation, if it's important to ask some questions, Kelly and I will be on a bit of a roll for parts of this, but I think that you know, we're going to try and monitor chat as we can. In worst case, we'll get to some Q&A at the end. So much appreciate the intention and that all of you have signed on to join us today. So we'll get into why we titled this Who Moved the Cheese, but those of you who've read the book probably already understand why as it relates to forecasting and figuring out what's happening next, or how to figure out what's going to happen next to our businesses during this time. Just by way of quick introduction, and I'll let Kelly do hers as well. She's much nicer than me, so she gets to end nicely. I'm Bob Green. I'm the partner responsible here at Singer-Lueck. I am partners with Andy Armstrong, for those of you who know Andy in your group. Andy, thank you for introducing us to this. We actually did this work, this presentation, for a really nice crowd in Orange County, where Kelly is also a board member at ACG Orange County. Just really nice to be in this environment with people who are just trying to get business done. Anyway, my role, I'm a former CFO, so this topic is near and dear to me. I'm also a CPA, but I run our systems consulting practice here at the firm, as well as our systems audit practice. And, you know, if you look at this, this all ties into, you know, how do we as professionals, in whatever capacity we're in, deal with the changing times. So without reading my bio, it's up on the screen, you have a general idea. I do a lot of speaking on technology of various kinds. We get very involved in digital transformation work as well. But I'll let Kelly explain a little bit more about herself, and then we'll get into that.
Awesome. Thank you, Bob. It's great. It's always great working with Bob. He's one of the few IT consultants out there that you can actually have fairly normal conversations with and joke about, and he gets my jokes. So that's very important. When you get an accountant and IT person that understand each other's jokes, right? There's something special. Just kidding. So by the way, I mean, I'm a CFO. I spend most of my time now working with boards. I sit on 3 public company boards. I chair audit committees. I'm on comp committees. I'm the co-chair of the LA Orange County Women Corporate Directors. I sit on the Cal State Fullerton Accounting Advisory Board. And as Bob talked about, I'm also on the board of ACG Orange County. So I'm spending a lot of time, you know, working with a lot of executives and talking through a lot of the issues that we have. I've spent a lot of time in the capital markets, raised a ton of capital, probably, I think it's, I don't know, close to $1 billion of capital for my companies that I've worked with. Spent a lot of time in strategic planning, process improvement, and then I've done a lot of restructuring. And then, you know, on the flip side, I like to have fun on the weekends and when I'm not working, although my boards in this time have been extremely crazy busy, as you can imagine. So looking forward to talking to you guys.
Thanks, Kelly. Yep. And I always enjoy being with you on these, Kelly, and you do great work, and it's just nice to share because this was right up Kelly's alley. When we knew we were going to talk about this kind of thing, it's important for us to deal with CFOs who understand kind of how to flex. We certainly have met a number of them who don't understand how to flex and project things. So Kelly's just exceptional with that and just thinks strategically. So let me share briefly, and I'm doing this because it helps qualify a little bit about what we're going to talk about. This isn't to give you a commercial. I wanted to show you Business Informatics Division is about systems consulting, and if you take a look at what we're showing here, the kind of work that we do involves a lot of different things: digital transformation, helping with complex technology projects. We sell no software, unlike a lot of CPA firms whose systems consulting practices involve sale of software. We have none. We are purposely objective and unbiased. So what we focus on are these areas, FP&A, which is part of what we're going over today. In fact, we also do some change management consulting. We're presenting today, in fact, at Orange County's ACG about change management and organizational development during these crazy times, motivating remote workforces. It's a lot of fun too. We also get involved in IT assurance. Andy Armstrong, in fact, has been great at referring us some really interesting Silicon Valley technology companies that are dealing with the challenges of putting together a SOC audit. If those of you who are watching have familiarity with that, it's probably a familiarity that says, yes, one more thing we have to do, and it's really challenging. So we get involved there. And we also provide CIO leadership. So think about us as a kind of experienced team that provides a lot of different angles. Not one of us is perfect at every one of those. So we have to kind of specialize. It's been a nice group to put together. Thank you for that. And Kelly, you want to share a little bit more about your expertise?
Sure. As we talked about, you went too far. See, that was my expertise in a flash. So as I talked about, spent a lot of time with capital markets. I've spent a lot of time with public companies. So I know a lot about what's affected them, how they're working, how they're moving forward. FP&A is a huge part of what we're doing right now, which is why it's great to partner with Bob. And you would think, well, how do you guys, work together and merge together? As a CFO, it's super important that you understand how to bring in the experts to help you through things and or provide additional, oomph coming in. And that's where Singer, Lewack, and Bob have been great partners for us. Because, as you have a lot of things to do in the business, you need that extra help. So we partner with them on a lot of different companies and a lot of different projects. And it's a great partnership, as you can imagine. So you same thing, organizational development. So it's interesting, right? So CFO does it from internal. Bob comes in and provides the guidance, but somebody in there has to be the sponsor and the corporate sponsor on it. So that's where we cross over on that. Same thing with ERP as CFOs, right? We don't necessarily, there's a lot of the work that we don't need to do and or want to do and or have time to do. So bring in Singer to be, a partner with us at that level. And then, CFO leadership, the gatekeeper to all aspects, financial aspects of the companies. I personally spent a lot of time restructuring. I actually took Fisker Automotive through their bankruptcy. So that's been a fun one. I've done a lot of work of companies that just need to get things done and come in. And as you can imagine, all these things come into play on that because it's a very disruptive time, which as we're dealing with COVID, and we'll talk a little bit later, right? It's a very disruptive time in understanding companies, in understanding where the future is, and understanding all the scenario analysis, which is also what you do a lot in the restructuring side. So thanks, Bob.
All right. So we're gonna get right into it. Thank you everybody for the few minutes of background. I hope it wasn't coming across too commercial-like. It's not our intention. The concept today really is gonna be, it's taking this from the angles of where we're coming from, which I think you now understand. What we're seeing is there's so much movement in the marketplace right now as to trying to figure out what to do next and what next is, and we're gonna share a little bit of our perspectives of things that people need to be thinking about, whether they're on the service provider side, right? Because a number of you are service providers. In some ACG groups, by the way, you have an extensive amount of service providers and very few internal, CFOs, CXOs, and that sort of thing. And in others, yours is a little bit different mix, which is great. And so we're going to talk to you from, I think either angle applies. This is just things that we really are hoping that as you walk through this, not only do you come out of this with some more knowledge about the FP&A process, which we'll explain what that actually means, but also how things work from a bit of a nuts and bolts angle, and also some concepts about why we need to be thinking about all the things that are moving around us so that we can project out some ideas that might be more relevant to make decisions with. So that's the theme of today. And I'm going to jump into this. So Really,
oh, there you go. Yeah, okay.
okay, so we're really kind of navigating new waters, right? And this is something that, we've been updating this deck now because we've done it a couple of times, but things keep changing, shocker. So I'm going to ask those of you who are watching, take a look at the first quote. It's probably worth reading for a second. And then I really want to read, I'm going to give you a second or two on that. Then I'm going to read the second one with you. So at the bottom of the first one, it talks about, innovation needed in goal setting and the operational model. What I liked was, these are from McKinsey, by the way. Wish we were quoted as McKinsey is. They got a little more depth than we do. The next one is great. Data is providing the fuel to power better and faster decisions. High performing organizations, this is pretty impressive, 3 times more likely than others to say that their data and their analytics initiatives, which is what we're talking about today, have contributed to at least 20% of earnings before income taxes. When you think about that, that's before COVID. Imagine how that impacts after or during COVID. And so if it's 3 times, some percentage better, right? Imagine where that's going now. This is just before, with fairly straightforward forecasting capability. So today we're going to essentially explore, how do we chart a course for, making sure our data that's relevant gets into the way that we look at the future. So Kelly, go ahead.
Yep. As we know, what's happening with COVID is unprecedented. There's not one area of any business, any person that it hasn't touched. And it's, we're more than, we have to be more aware of all the impacts to the businesses, right? You've had all employees are impacted, customers are impacted, vendors are impacted, service providers are impacted, supply chains. So, your plans and budgets out the window. And it's 2 different ways, right? I mean, it might be, I have actually one of my companies that's doing a decontamination and disinfecting service. Their first quarter revenue was more revenue than all of last year. So we have an additional, issue of the one that's good to have, right? All the orders coming in, and you had no idea that you would have to have your supply chain engaged that fast, trying to figure out how to manage through customers, trying to figure out how to jump in there with COVID coming on. So it's just been a crazy time. And that's understanding what it's doing to your business. And I have other companies that are, so one of the other companies I sit on the board of, their subsidiary manages the commodity USO. So, US oil, as this was going through when oil went negative. So there was a lot of issues around that. So it's been a very interesting time. And then if you're a service provider, right, you're dealing how it impacts your client's business. If you're in the insurance or the banking industry, and then how are you engaging? Even as an employer, how are you engaging in with all of your stakeholders? As a service provider, how are you engaging with all of your stakeholders? And then now you're looking at unexpected risks, something that you would never think of doing, right? Out there right now that no modeling would have put in place. Like you would have never modeled, what if I just don't have my people come into the office for 9 months, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody in their right mind would have ever modeled that coming into the new year. Now you're stuck with it and saying, wow, now I have a deployed workforce. What does that look like? And then, like I said, the flip side of your unexpected opportunities, the companies that have been able to pivot, have been able to churn, have been able to take advantage, such as my decontamination and disinfecting company. Those have been amazing opportunities that come in. But it doesn't matter whether you're up, down, the same. As a board member, I literally am spending anywhere from 1 to 3 days a week in meetings with my boards, just because things are moving fast, happening fast, and we're trying to continue to build the new base cases because it's flattening out a little bit better now because we have our handle around it. But the reality is week to week, it's changing, and companies are facing that.
And I think that the theme, Kelly, tell me if you disagree. I think the theme is that whether it's because of COVID or just any old normal business sense of we're always in a world that's got things going on. What's talked about today and some of the things we're going to share apply to all of that. It's just that right now COVID's exacerbating the need to really think about it and actually exposing those companies that aren't thinking about adjusting their forecast to make decisions. So I'm going to continue here. So the next slide, we're talking about, look, this is really a planner's nightmare. So those people who are responsible for, and I'm sure some of you who are watching today or participating today understand this because some of this might fall on you. Things keep moving, right? The goalposts are, moving down the field while you're trying to complete the pass and run to the end zone. So that's never fun, right? In football or here. So football, we may have that one day. Anyway, so the thought is this, real-time data is needed to make decisions anyway. right? I think we'd all agree with that. But right now it's changing faster than we know, and we have to refresh it all the time. And that's a lot of work. I mean, our firm, okay, we have what, and Andy would correct me, I guess. I think we're around 400 some odd people here. You know, there's a lot of moving parts, and we're in multiple states, and there's a lot of things to think about our own things like cash flow and collections and you know, revenue projections and employee count and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, things that you kind of assumed before that were kind of moving along and manageable with whatever changes were impacting you have changed dramatically. If you look at this, and this is just an example Kelly and I threw together, was in January, New Year's information was there. Everyone kind of looked at their next year and kind of had an idea what was going on. And that's stale now. It's over, gone. We all know that. And then April comes, right? We thought, well, we'll be back to work in, you know, a month or two. I mean, how many of us remember in April saying, oh, you know, I know we can't get together now, but when we're safe to go out again, we'll see you in May, you know, and that doesn't happen, and it hasn't happened much. So particularly here in California. So we had COVID, you know, that whole issue to deal with, and PPP. So PPP changed the forecasting concepts. So not only do we have a pandemic with all the changes in attendance and people's attention and all that, right, the stay-at-home thing, then we have PPP money, which just throws everything off from a cash flow perspective for those who did get it. Those who didn't have another issue entirely. When we move into September, right, which we just got into, as we know, now, are we back to work? Are we not? Are we back to school? Are we not? I mean, Andy, you know, I know how hard it is working with the kids at home, you know, and things, and you've got so much going on. I mean, that's not easy. And is it, you know, what impact is that having on productivity, right? Not of yours, but I'm saying in general, you know, productivity is a big question mark and all these things going on. And it would be nice to know that we could look at December and have any clue what to do generally in some ways. And I think we have to make, you know, really intelligent decisions about where we think it'll be based on our own knowledge of our own business impacts. And the election is another thing to throw in. So we'll have COVID still going on at some point then. Hopefully there's something coming down the pipe for mitigation. But in December, we're gonna also have had an election, right? So how do we project for the impact of that? So anyway, we want to show you a timeline concept because that timeline is very real about dealing with real-time data. In addition, Kelly's going to jump in next to a whole area that talks about not just the timeline, but what about the life cycle of a business that can be thrown off by something like a pandemic.
Yeah, so I know this is a busy slide, but it, you know, it really looks at, so pre-COVID, companies were on a couple of trajectories, right? You're either in a high growth, steady state, or declining growth, right? And then COVID hit, and was it your risk or your opportunity, right? Did you go from a high growth to even a higher growth? Did your high growth now maybe go to steady state? Or are you just getting killed as a couple of the industries are? And same thing through. So now you've got this, you know, what happens in COVID. Now, where do we go post-COVID, right? And the big question mark, and that's where the scenario analysis come in. I've always been a big fan of scenario analysis. I mean, even when I was CFO, I never just put together one budget. I never just put together one forecast. I was always looking at rolling forecast. I was always looking at what if. I was always getting close to my teams and my sales teams and my supply chains and all of that coming through. And now, you know, with the disruptors and like I said, the risks or opportunities, we all know that the supply chain is a massive risk. And that isn't even necessarily with COVID. It's a second trajectory around all the issues with China, because so much of our supply chain is coming from China. So now you have to pivot. That doesn't happen fast. You know, one of the things, again, as a CFO that I marvel at and that really brought to light through all this is, you know what, we got just-in-time inventory down. I mean, you know, I'm really proud of how we had just-in-time inventory. But now when something like this happens, all of a sudden you're like, oh crap, I have no inventory because my whole supply chain got disrupted. I didn't risk mitigate enough to have alternative supply chains because I couldn't really get to the point of where it made sense from a cost perspective. So that's going to be a big change now. And you know, as executives and corporate officers, you're asking those questions. How are you mitigating your supply chain risk? And, you know, again, we used to do that a long time ago. These last 10 years or 15 years, we got so caught up in this global economy thinking we can get stuff whenever we want because we've been able to, right? And we've been driving prices down, and we kind of went down into a sole supply chain, maybe had some alternatives, but really didn't have them set up the way they need to be. And even the large companies, right? It's not just us. You look at, you know, the masks coming in, right? And all the stuff that, who would have thought that we got all of our masks from China? Who would have thought that we haven't made penicillin in the United States since 2004, right? I mean, there's some things that got exposed that all of a sudden you're going, wow. So now we have a whole different scenario analysis, and we have a whole different, where do I look at my risks and opportunities, and how do I project for those, right? COVID is here to stay. I mean, honestly, it is. It's not going away. The vaccine is not going to wipe it out. So how do I look at a post-COVID world and deal with, and going back to, right, because in China, they've had COVID viruses since the 2000s. So they've been dealing with SARS, MERS, and now the COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
So how do I turn my company into being more versatile, digital centric and agile, right?
Mm-hmm.
So everything's moving at lightning fast speed, faster than it ever has before. And it's been, this has been one of the benefits coming out of it is what are the paradigm shifts? And,
Mm-hmm.
To Bob's point earlier, data is becoming a bigger and bigger push because number one, now we're getting forced into it, and it's just going to become more and more integrated into our life, because once you move there, you don't take that step back.
Yeah, I was thinking literally this week, as we keep seeing things about the airlines and the cutoff of their PPP and the mandates from that, and the layoffs that are expected pretty quickly. It's interesting. Think about being in the shoes of the planners there, right? They've got, okay, people are starting to take some trips because they're really getting stir crazy. But on the other hand, we've got this, and this going on from a safety risk perspective. And we have to lay off our people, so that changes. So think about all the impacts on the data and the drivers that happen there. We're going to get into data drivers right away in a minute, but it's trying to figure out what was going on when they were moving at a really good pace. And then all of a sudden they hit this area, as Kelly's got in the green circles. Where do we go next? If I'm an airline, or if I'm Uber, or if I'm Lyft, I'm trying to figure out how much that trajectory down can be leveled off, and how realistic is it to even think it can. And how do I build my modeling to be realistic of kind of best case, worst case? That's hard to do. So this is really providing a lot of challenge. And just by way of color, I'm not sure how many of you have been through an FP&A or planning experience in general, but I went to a conference that the AICGSV puts on every year, and I'm speaking at it in October. It's basically for finance professionals, and all deals around this area called FP&A. And I remember sitting at one of the breakout tables at lunch, and there's probably 300 or 400 people that attend this conference. It's a nice conference, and you look around, and everybody was starving for finding the right data scientists to work with them, or the right people that could do this in their company, because this isn't something that happens like overnight. You can't just pick up Excel and say, I got this. And so I remember the scarcity of people that know how to deal with this in general. That's pre-pandemic. So when you think about what's happening now, to Kelly's points in these slides, there's a lot going on that's really hard to manage, even with the best of the people that you can find, if you can find them. A lot of them are. So anyway, I'm going to move on. Kelly, anything else on the slide though before I get into the description of FP&A?
Nope, it's just looking for the next normal, right? What is our next normal? I don't like to say new, because I think we're in an ever evolving, changing world. I think this is now going to become the next normal, where you do have to be more agile and swift, and really truly understand the drivers, and then be able to be nimble to switch drivers, because the drivers that come into effect today may not be here a year from now.
Absolutely.
We don't know what's going to be next. So it's really continuing to iterate and think outside the box.
Totally. Absolutely. We're going to get really into a nice conversation about drivers in a second. I'm going to first just define the practice here we're talking about. So FP&A, I'm hoping some of you already look at this and go, well, of course I get that. And some of you are probably looking at this going, I'm not a real expert at it, or don't know enough to really what it means. So that's fine. Many people don't know what FP&A mean anyway, when you talk about it in a general business conversation. So for a second, forgive me if you already get all this, but we're going to do this for a second. The FP&A discipline involves really two different activities. The activities are the ones in gold. Okay, so we're going to work our way down for a second. The gold activities are really what happens. So there's forecasting and budgeting, which for all of us who have accounting backgrounds, or people like Kelly who really thrive in this kind of thing, forecasting and budgeting is a big piece of it, right? It's as a CFO or a financial professional, you can't really go without providing some level of, analysis of the past versus plan, as well as the forecast of the plan to then ultimately actualize. So there's a lot going on there. That's the art of, and it's a lot of spreadsheet type thinking, right? A lot of spreadsheet type looks and feels, and you can graph out the results. And then there's data analytics, which is the other practice area of this, which is we're looking more at illustrative information. It doesn't always have to be financial data. It can be all kinds of different things, right? It's how you look at things. People talk about dashboards. What do they see? They see charts, they see graphs, they see statistics, they see a variety of things. That's all brought forth through data analytics. the tool sets used to provide forecasting and budgeting are not always the same tool sets, meaning software, as those that provide data analytics. In some cases they are, and they're combined. Some of the tools allow you to do both. Some allow you only to do one or the other. And some of them are pretty basic and they allow you to kind of take Excel and make it look a little prettier. Okay, so we're not going to talk about tools today. I'm happy to do that offline. That's kind of what we deal with our clients. Sometimes they say, what software should we use? We help them with that. We help them oversee the implementation and plan out why they're doing what they're doing, right? So in this area though, just understand there's a lot of flexibility, but FP&A includes the two broader activities of forecasting and budgeting, and also illustrating and analyzing data so that people can look at it much more, I guess for the lack of a better word, analytically, and then make decisions with it. The key part here we all know is that can't happen without data. Well, that's a given. So we're not going to talk about data yet, okay? But we are going to talk about right now, the three pieces on the bottom are really what drive the value of doing FP&A in the first place, right? If it's just looking at the past, we all know we can do that. You know, assuming our accounting systems have tracked information well enough, we can run a report. We all know that. The difference is that when you start putting thinking in to the puzzle, you have to start thinking about what are our risks, right? So now we're dealing with how do we forecast all those goofy arrows that lived in the slide Kelly was talking about. You know, what do we do about that? We've got risks coming down the pipeline. How do we assess what those are and what the impact is on our business? And how do we translate that into what we can forecast for the next X months or the next X weeks? In some cases, frankly, in April, many people were just worried about what was going on week to week, so they had money to pay the bills. So thinking that way, that's one thing. Number two, you have to think about what intelligence and judgment you need to apply to whatever it is that's going to impact your forecast. So if you had a model before and you're using it to develop a forecast for your business, you have to think through, you know, I really thought hard about that about 2 years ago. And these are the things that we can really rely on that impact our forecast, the kind of statistics we worry about, the kind of headcount things, the kind of supply chain issues, whatever it might be. Now, particularly during times of change, FP&A requires you to really rethink and fine tune that assessment of what's going to impact us. What do we need to think about? Are there new things we hadn't thought about before that we need to add to this? Things like supply chain disruption, and Kelly, you'll share that in a minute. Then there's the drivers. Okay, so all these kind of lead to what are the levers that we want to play with that are going to impact where our projections end up, right? So instead of just saying last year times 3% or 1.03 or whatever it is for an increase of last year to this year, that's one way to forecast, by the way. It's kind of the stuff that software vendors love to show you because, wow, that's easy, right? But the reality is the drivers are much more complicated than that usually. And the algorithms to forecast with are not always so easy. So you apply intelligence to drivers. The drivers actually push the model into directions A or B. It could be something as simple as a driver could be, we're going to expect that headcount increases by X% for the first 3 months. Then we're going to have some quieter time because we're a seasonal business. And then we're going to have an increase in, you know, the end of the year. That's kind of normal driver thinking, right? So anyway, the concept here is that FP&A as a whole is based on these sorts of actual thinking processes, but that feed the data that you're going to use to be analytical and relevant. And then we essentially figure out, what are we going to do with it? Okay, are we going to forecast and budget with it? Or are we really going to start analyzing data and figure out, well, forecasted cash flow looks like X, so we got to make some decisions, right? So Kelly, I know you're going to dive into a lot of different things about how the cheese moved and such. So we're going to move on. Okay,
great. It's a great overview. I love that slide. You know, you think it's easy, but the reality is there's so much that's coming into play. And I think that a lot of companies, we kind of get caught up in our FP&A functions, like you said. It's like, hey, we want to see top line growth, or I want to, you know, launch a new product. And, you know, now customers are engaging entirely different, right? Cash flow management is different. Your supply chains management's different. Your customers aren't going to want to pay as fast. In retail, you had to pivot to an e-commerce platform. So, you know, you know, navigating uncertain territory, you know, requires accurate, valid data. I would actually argue that at all times you want accurate, valid data. It can be more predictable. I think in these times they're not. And I think I go into this and I ask my businesses and my clients, I said, you know, are you going to try and be a lagger or a leader, right? It's important to understand what's your position going to be? I mean, everybody wants to be a leader, but are you really acting like it? Are you really, you know, going in and doing what needs to be done? You know, are you managing your cash flows? You know, a lot of companies do, they manage their cash flows, but are they doing it the way that makes sense? Or they just put in a spreadsheet and said, I have these outflows, these inflows, and I can adjust these things, right? And then as your manager, are you going down into exactly like I said, are you working with your customers to make sure that if they come and say, I'm not paying you till net 90, well, what does that mean to my cash flows, right? Now I have to set up a whole new supply chain. What does that really truly mean to my cash flows? So your drivers are completely changing on this right now. You know, and then you want to work now with your customers and suppliers. What I see is really cool that's happening. There's more conversations between customers and suppliers than there's ever been. There's more sharing of data. There's more, you know, wanting to know, what are you guys seeing? What are you doing? How's it impacting you? Right? Because everybody's trying to get to those best practices, or trying to, and also trying to find that nugget of how do I pivot to either take advantage of it, survive, or is it truly at a point where I should really, you know, shut down a lot of my operations, or, you know, go skinny and go light to wait it out. Those are valid concerns that people have. You got to take another view of profitability. You know, my company that I talked about that I sit on the board of, you know, we talked through that. I said, you know, you got to look at when you have that much demand coming in, you better be prioritizing your customers, right? Find out the ones that are going to be your long-term customers, and you better prioritize them. And then you also better make sure you're profitable. And some of the orders that you get just might not be the orders that you want. I mean, they may not be the right type of orders for the amount of effort that you have to be when you're growing that fast. Nobody ever wants to turn away a customer, but sometimes you have to make hard decisions. You know, you have to reproject your revenues and expenses, taking into account your new factors. There's a lot of things that are happening here. Your productivity, for one. You know, you have employees that have small children at home, and I don't know how they do it. Thank God mine are older, because I swear to gosh, I would probably be very psycho if I had young kids that I had to teach elementary school to and try and do everything that's going on. So, and that's just the reality of this next normal right now. And is it a bubble, or is it a long-term thing? It's a long-term thing, but you have to be realistic that you're probably, you know, you're seeing increases in productivity in certain things, but you're not necessarily getting productivity across the board. So what's that doing to your business?
Exactly.
Yeah. And then, you know, is your finance function up to code, right? Is your finance function, can you do this? Are you ready to, you know, can you provide this information? And, you know, and if you can't, you better figure out how to do it pretty fast, because nimble and quick is the way to the future. And then, you know, as we're going to continue to talk about, business is more data driven. And it changes and it's going. And if you're not going to catch up and stay ahead of the game, you're going to lose out.
Absolutely. Kelly, thank you. I think, you know, we're going to pick up a little steam here. The concept of who moved my cheese is such a telling thing. I'm just going to bring up the analogy. We use that title from the book about organizational development. It's all about change. How do we manage change? It's a good book if you haven't read it. It's a good example from the corporate space of when things happen, what do people do? How do they scurry around and they use a mouse and cheese, of course, and a maze as a way to look at all this. But the concept is no different. We're trying to figure out how do we not, you know, go out of control, but scramble as best we can to come up with appropriate actions and respond appropriately. So we're going to get into a little bit more about essentially what to think about in terms of those things that relate to cheese being moved in the maze. So Kelly, I know you're on here, so thank you. And you covered some of these, but thank you.
Yeah, I've already covered some of this. So, you know, you guys can read through it here. You know, with disruption and change, your risk profile increases. You know, are you ready to understand that? And are you being honest about what your risk profile is? Mm-hmm. You know, and then what are some of the risks brought on by the pandemic that would impact forecasting? Again, the then and the now. So if you go back to that one chart that I had, right, that had the scenario plan analysis and the question mark. So you're in where we're at now. Where do we want to be? How do we get there? And it takes all these different things that we really talked about, you know, supply chain, productivity, financial exposure, and treasury. So again, we have to rethink the model.
Yep, agreed. We also have this situation where drivers really aren't the same. And Kelly, I know we talked about some of these, but you know, we really have to think of, you know, I'll tackle the first one. I know you've got some things here too, but we want to think about the survivability of customers and vendors. You know, what we're seeing in some of our clients are situations where they've had to not just change suppliers, but they've also had to figure out, you know, do we really believe that customer X is going to come through with the forecasted projections of purchasing that they thought they'd have, as well as can we really buy from supplier X? Do we really think that's going to be a real likely scenario? So I'm sure that affects a number of you as well as some of the businesses you advise, but these are areas that I think sometimes people forget to deal with in the forecast, and the energy it may take to deal with fluctuations in either price or collection timing and that sort of thing, or essentially profitability from products from when your margins go down. So there's a little bit of a thought there. Kelly, thanks. I just wanted to jump on that one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, and a couple of other nuggets too, right? So your continuity survivability, a lot of that depends upon the industry and the geography. You know, we still don't understand what our ongoing relationship with China is going to be as far as being able to get products out of there, as far as, you know, having your supply chain. So you talk to a lot of companies that had a lot of supply chain in China. They had alternative suppliers, but they were all in China, right? So again, you had some geographic risks that, again, you know, in the past, we never would have thought of as a big risk because China's big. And if you're at either ends of the country or in the larger cities, you would assume that you'd be able to still get things out of there. So that's changing. You know, productivity, that's been a big one that people just need to understand where's it going to level out at what time, right? When are, you know, maybe what is the new level of productivity coming through? Is it a blip because of the schooling from home and working from home? You know, where is it and where and when are you going to? So how do you model that and make sure that you're actively included in your model? Margins, right? I mean, you're seeing a big effect on margins across the board. Some of it's from trying to get alternative suppliers. Some of it's from people taking advantage of you know, if they're in a high growth business. Some of it's from a retooling of companies that, you know, realize that they you know, we talk about the hand sanitizer, right? The company that moved to making the hand sanitizer. And, you know, you haven't, again, you would never model that. So now you're going back and looking at, okay, what do I need? Where's my cash going to fall out? And part of that was definitely the employees wanted to push to make it. And so the company's like, yeah, we should do it. We should do it from just good corporate governance because we have the ability and the tools to do it. So shutting down a production line and retooling it to make something like hand sanitizer. So a lot of different things that are out there.
It's interesting. Sorry to interrupt. You know, it's interesting. I know about that case as well. What's interesting to me is think of the impact. If you are, I think that was Unilever, right, with swab sanitizer. Yeah. I think when you look at the impact of that, what does that have on the retailers, right? Because, you know, the retailers who buy from, you know, whatever's going to be made in that plant at that time normally is going to be not made in that plant at that time normally. And so how does one on the supplier side coordinate with the buyer at the retail side to think about, you know, you're probably not going to get the shipment of what you thought you were going to get just yet because we decided pandemic has to take priority and we're going to work on these things. And I hope you don't mind, but we're going to have to take a pause on that. And, you know, I know you've got customer demand, but, you know, we're going to work on these things. So these are ramifications that are significant. And the question would be then, what are you giving up to do something? And how does that impact your forecast? Right? Because in their sense, they've decided to produce something else, whether the margin's better or not, they're actually giving up something else. So the impact isn't just, oh, we're now making sanitizer at the plant in, you know, wherever Wisconsin. We're now all of a sudden realizing that we're also not making whatever we were making in that plant in wherever Wisconsin, I'm using a state. And that could be also worthy of forecast adjustments. So these are important, you know, I mean, maybe they're making something that was uber profitable before at a much higher price point, who knows, right? But anyway, that kind of came up. And then I think the other point, Kelly, we talked about this as we planned this, Best Buy, right? They had to flip on a dime during this process and said, you know what, I know our volume's down, but if we do curbside delivery, we'll make it work. And that doesn't sound like rocket science today. But at the time, they were working on the curbside delivery process and trying to figure that out for months. And then all of a sudden COVID hit, you know what, they got it done in about a week.
Yeah.
So, you know, could they have forecasted that quickly? I don't think so. So anyway, it's, you know, these things happen and we're just using real life examples. So thanks.
Well, I mean, it's to the point. I mean, you know, as you come out of it, cybersecurity is going to be a bigger issue because again, most companies, there's been a lot of push by the next generation of wanting to work from home, have the ability to work from home. And companies are like, wait, we're just not set up that way. And we're not really sure about the cybersecurity and it's going to take a lot of effort. And oh my gosh, look at within a week, how many companies pivoted. Yes, there were issues. Yes, there were bumps in the road, but you know, there's still some cleanup on the back end of that for cybersecurity. So, you know, now your cybersecurity risk has gone through the roof. How are you adjusting through that, right? What precautions now are you taking with a remote workforce to be able to do that? And, you know, that's one that's, I don't think people understand the risk associated with that because again, we're just trying to survive and we're willing to take the risk. But as you move into the next, the next phase of all of this, whether or not you're going to allow people to continue to work from home, you've got to make big decisions. Workers' comp, soft tissues. Is your workforce, do they have an ergonomically set up at home, especially the younger generation? How many of them are sitting in their beds or sitting on the couch working and they're like this, right? And so you don't have a way of understanding that. So where do the soft tissue come in, and how are you risk mitigating through that? And also being able to provide the service that you need to your employees. And then, those are some of the things that you can't necessarily capture. But when you're talking about all these changes, right, it's time to look at, and this is where Singer comes in, right? Are your systems able to capture the data that you need, right? Are your systems flexible enough? Are you being able to get the inputs from your systems? And then can you appropriately model it, and can you appropriately pivot and change it? So those are some big issues that companies are working really hard. And, I think Bob and I, we always say that, my thing is Excel is a great tool, but Excel should not be your end all, right? It does allow you some flexibility, but the more that you pick up and try and input and not have it generate from your systems, but it definitely is a bridge. So, there's a lot of that Bob and I talk about that. And we're not getting into the different types of systems, but you really need to look at that and find out, how am I capturing it, and how do I continue to capture it as my business changes and morphs into what the next normal is.
Kelly, if it's okay, I'm going to go right into that point about where does data live, only because of time. So we're going to go right to that. Kelly's mentioning exactly the kinds of things that we see. People are often trying to load up Excel well beyond their capabilities. And we were working with a client in March where they came to us and said, we're doing an acquisition. We already run 3 different subsidiaries out of our headquarters office. And we've been using Excel to roll up all of our forecasts. And they were going out of their minds to the point where they had their 2 top people in finance spending most of their time in Excel just pulling their hair out, validating and reconciling and confirming that the data in Excel was reasonably reliable, right? Before they could worry about the formulas to push them into a forecast and a budget analysis. So that's just, there's all kinds of ways to deal with that. And one of the challenges is, when you're busy worrying about the tool and you're worrying about the machinery that goes on, to make a forecast or a budget to actual reporting thing make sense, you're kind of forgetting about, what data do I need? Where does the data come from? And could I be doing it differently? Should I be thinking about external data, right? So in this particular slide, we're sharing a little bit about, think about this. If you're putting together a forecast, to really think through it, and if you start from scratch, you probably look at 2 different places. One, what data do you have that lives in your own business, not just transactionally, but also from a variety of different perspectives, such as just static data, like customer information that might not be a transaction, but might be a really important statistic or a metric that you need to know, or just a data point, what state are they in, right? So, there's all these different things that you have in your databases, in your own companies, that are vital to dealing with forecasting. There's also other information you keep in your companies that people keep in spreadsheets or wherever they might do it, even in notes, that are relevant, things about competitor information, things about volume statistics of things that they might be tracking, things around weather patterns that they might be tracking. Different things that you guys keep in your businesses might be really vital to a forecast if you step back and said, I wonder if anybody here's been thinking about that. I think John's got that. It doesn't have to live in a system, but it probably already lives there somewhere. So as you're thinking about, what do you own, what do you have, what do you control within your 4 walls-ish, how many walls of many rooms, how do you start aggregating that into becoming valuable for you? Because you already have access to that. The hard part that you don't have access to is external source data. And what we're finding is that external source data ends up getting pulled into some of the better models where needed and from the proper sources. It's got to be reliable. It's got to be valid. It's got to have fidelity. You have to make sure that it makes sense for what you're trying to project. And it's not just out of sequence of time or perspective. But things like, we talked about this, some of the things that are current now, what states are open for business and which ones are not, so as you're forecasting volume, if you're a national company, is it appropriate to think about and pull in data, a 1 meaning, maybe an instance of 1 or true is, yes, they're open for business this month, and a 0 means no, they're not. That may change next month, change by week. We're in California, we all know that, and things are hard to predict for sure, although I think it's a little more consistent that we're locked down for a while. Anyway, we've got other things, populations of illnesses, trends, things that Google manages for you, all these things that can impact cellular tracking. Where are people going? Where are people moving with their phones? When they're in Fort Lauderdale on spring break, where do they go from there? All that data is available if you need it, if it's even relevant. If you're selling to college kids that are 18 to 22, you probably want to know where they're moving around and migrating, right, during this period of time. So all this data helps. It's all what you do with it. It goes back to our chart of the intelligence that has to go into adding data into your model. But again, if we get stuck on doing forecasts the same old way we did last year, or the year before, we're not very interesting. That's okay, but it's not going to work now. So, Kelly, you want to add anything on that before I jump on?
Nope.
Okay. Then there's this. This is essentially how do we look at our information? And our information can be dealt with this. Kelly, I'll have you for sure share about scenarios and forecasting because I know that's a near and dear to you. The metrics and standards and KPIs, key performance indicators, are used and are part of the FP&A process, more in the analytics, right? Where it says, if you've got standards and metrics that you're shooting for or trying to measure on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis, that's great. Concept is you have to assess if they're still valid anymore, or how do you change those? Because when your analytics are feeding a variance between what you expected to be performing at and where you actually performed, your variance may be bigger or smaller based on invalid assumptions, right? If you've left it alone during COVID and it's something that really should have been rethought during COVID, maybe you're not so far off from where the metrics should have been and where the measurements came out with variances. So you have to really kind of think through, what are you trying to look at the end of the day? Because all that energy feeds, all that data feeds, and the intelligence, it feeds the data, which feeds your analytics. And again, if you know what you're looking to, get out of the forecasting process and the analytics process, then you can kind of work your way backwards and think about how, are your assumptions fair? Are the drivers you're creating fair, right? All those things, it goes back to that. Kelly, thank you. I'll shush and jump into scenarios.
Yeah, no, I mean, like you said, I'm a big fan of scenario analysis and scenario planning for a lot of different reasons, right? I think it forces people to think outside the box and do more of the what if. Also looks at, push them. So, lifetime value of customer is always one of the KPI metrics that most businesses look at. So, where are you at with COVID, right? Some people's lifetime value is increasing, because they're now, like you look at the nutraceutical space. Right? Mm-hmm. People are popping pills like crazy because it's like whatever I can take to prevent me from getting sick, I'm doing. So all of a sudden you see this perceived lifetime value go up. But when we get out of this, this pandemic, is that going to change their behavior? Right? And are we looking at that or are we going back to normal? You're probably going to see a drop off. You're probably not going to go back to where you were at pre-COVID. I won't say normal, pre-COVID, because now people are looking at and say, wait a second, as I said, COVID's here to stay. So there's a lot of different things that you should be looking at. You should be looking at some of your market positioning. You should be looking at, mm-hmm. the work from home and modeling all that is do I want to keep a dispersed workforce, right? Do I not? What places do I? Oh, by the way, what's that mean long-term? And we haven't gotten into the organizational development. Again, that's a different discussion, but how am I developing my future generation of leaders? How does mm-hmm. that create, mm-hmm. and again, that's more of your 5-year plan, right? Is if I have a remote workforce, who's going to be leading my workforce in 5 or 10 years? Like normally when you're in the office, you have a management training. What does that look like? Now that's been completely disrupted. So there's a lot of different things to be thinking about on there. That's not just your standard. Well, what if I can get an extra $1 of that? Or what if I can get an extra point on margin, right? There's bigger drivers on there. And a lot of it as a financial leader, you have to ask those questions. And, mm-hmm. And I love asking those thought-provoking ones because it does make companies really, really, refine and think about where they want to be.
Absolutely. I think, the hard part, and I don't know how many of you who are watching today are advising companies around these kinds of things. It's what we find is when we do bring up the concepts that early on in some of our projects where we say, what are you really trying to measure? What's the measurable outcome you're looking for from this project or this initiative? And much less what are you trying to measure as your business performance indicators? Sadly, and again, this goes pretty sizable companies all the way down to very entrepreneurial startups. We will often hear nothing, crickets. Mm-hmm. or very vague things that can't be measured. And one of the things that, in fact, that's a great time where we would call Kelly, and we have in the past, say, look, you know what, someone's going to have to develop some better KPIs for these guys before we actually move forward, because why start architecting, forecasting, or even an ERP solution around something where you really don't know what you're shooting for at the end? So these things are important. And I think it takes a financial mind. It takes also an operational understanding and thinking through what really matters most to my business and what do I want to look at the end of the day? Because why else put all the technology in and worry about all the data if you can't kind of go there? So maybe I'm preaching to the choir. I don't know all of you, but I know Kelly and I are definitely uniform on that. And oh, that made some sense. We're going to bring it all together. This is our last slide. Thinking about a revised forecast. This is almost like a quick how-to, right? If you really think about it. So if you really begin with the end in mind, it's a Stephen Covey phrase for those of you who follow that. Figure out what you need to know and figure out when you need to know it. Typically right now it's now because things are changing so fast. And then you move into the consider all the risks. Earlier you saw in our illustration at the very bottom you had risk assessments and you also had drivers. Really thinking through what risks do we have to think through that are going to impact the data that we need to look at. And also what are the drivers that we need to build to make our model apply to those risks? How do we look at things up and down? And then we determine how we want to look at our data, right? How often and for what purpose? And frankly, in what format? Do we want to look at scenarios? Do we want to look at, more of a grid of Excel and things that really are more analytically shown versus a graph and some charts and things like that? How do we look at that? We're going to want to make sure we understand the best sources of that data. I mentioned earlier the fidelity requirements. One of the biggest mistakes that happens, and if you talk to CIOs and you talk to a number of people who are in the database administration side of things, architecting a data warehouse is really a pain in the butt. There's a reason for that. Some people on our team will do that, and it's a data aggregation process. It's really hard. The reason is, it may seem straightforward to say, oh, I've got transactional data that I'm going to put into this data place that's going to forecast my business. Okay, that's fine. Those are transactions. That's understood. There's usually a date. There's usually some kind of parameter. You kind of understand it. But then you start bringing in other data that may not be date sensitive or really clear about what data related to. Things like accounting cutoff is also another issue, right? And we all know it, how was your month? And someone says, oh, I had a great month. And we say, oh, really? Yeah, we were up 20%. Was that in bookings, we'll ask, or was that in shipping, right? Was that deliveries or was that what you sold before delivery? So things like that, you have to just kind of make sure you're talking apples to apples, because when you put data from multiple places my hands look funny in Zoom, don't they? Anyway, when you put data from multiple places into an aggregated data warehouse, you better make sure it's relevant to itself, to each other. It's got to be relational. If it's not, and this is really talking about February, but you were looking at March over here because you really didn't think about the cutoff, that's a problem. So I won't harp on it, but understand the challenges and the naming of that, right? So thinking through the name of something called, revenues. Well, one bit of data comes in and says revenues are defined as, well, whatever defined it to get the data the way it was here. But then revenue comes in from your other data source. Well, that may not be the same. Again, booking versus shipping. There's two examples of revenue. They're both revenue, right? Depending on how you look at it. So these are things you have to think through. What is it that we're aggregating, and how do we make sure it's relevant to itself, right? Before we deal with it. Then you have to test and build a model. That's actually not easy either, but generally speaking, people can coordinate that. That's a little bit more technical and a little bit more straightforward. Those of you who've done it in Excel know that's not always easy, but some of the tools that are out there now are making it better. And then essentially, utilize it and make sure it's fitting your needs. And you kind of go through this cycle again. You go back to the top, make sure you know what you're getting. Are you getting what you wanted? Do you have to refine it? So that's the overall cycle, if you will, to build a revised forecast and really think through it. I hope that was helpful. Kelly, I obviously want to throw it out to you before we seek it.
Yeah. The only thing I would say is that you want to integrate this into your daily and or weekly, however you're forecasting. You need to be thinking of this and think of the process in mind, as opposed to just going through a task of saying, okay, I'm updating numbers, I'm updating percentages, let's go forward. This is really important that you continue to and get your teams to think about it, right? There'll be a better finance and or management team if they're constantly be thinking about this. Now, you don't want to get analysis paralysis, right? So that's right. Also the other part. Like I love my scenario planning, but I'm not an analysis paralysis stuff. It's like, let's find the key elements to do that. But let's also develop the culture that is thinking through all this versus just updating a spreadsheet.
Absolutely. I think with that, we did pretty good. It's just before 11. Thank you, Kelly. This is always fun with you. I hope that, I know we don't have a particularly large crowd today, but I know, thank you all for sticking with it and whatnot. I don't see Q&A in my screen, but Kelly, are you able to see any in yours or
Yeah, we don't have any chat out there right now. So, you
Okay.
know, Bob and I are available for a couple of questions. If I know we got started a couple of minutes late, so well, I guess I should let Yvonne dictate that. But I mean, I know I don't have a hard stop at 11. I know Bob doesn't, although he's got to get ready for his next deal at noon.
Yeah.
So, but if you guys have any questions, you know, let us know. Or, you know, here's how you can reach either Bob or myself. And, you know, we'd love to have conversations with you.
Absolutely. And thank you everybody for the time today. So thank you, Kelly.
Yep. Thank you, Bob. And thank you, Yvonne.
Thank you, Kelly and Bob. This was interesting to say the least. Thank you so much for this presentation. And we will be sharing that with all the attendees. So they will definitely get your contact information. So if anybody has any follow-up questions, that shouldn't be a problem. I don't see any chat questions as of now. So I think that will be it for today then.
Right.
Appreciate everyone dialing in. Thanks again to Bob and Kelly, and we'll see everyone soon in another event.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.
You too. Bye.
Bye now.